why China refuses to clarify the border with India, how China is using this strategic ambiguity to pressurize India, and why this problem has remained unresolved till date. India and China do not share settled border, rather they share ambiguity. And over the years, China has decided to use this ambiguity and converted it into strategic pressure. Hello everyone, welcome to Vajiram and Ravi's Flash News. My name is Shubhangi Singh and today we are going to understand that why China wants to remain vague about the boundary with India and how it has been using it to their advantage to keep the strategic pressure without entering into a situation of extreme possibilities, which can be connected to the recent incidents we have seen, for example, coming up of Arunachal Pradesh as core interest for China, or China not allowing passengers via their country because of them holding Arunachal Pradesh residentship or the Indian passport. So when we are talking about this whole scenario, the first important thing that comes as a question is the very fact itself that why actually our line of actual control, that is LAC, is a structural source of continuous conflict. Why it is not resolved? What is the problem here? So the problem here is the fact that when we are talking about line of actual control, if you see it is marked, it is three sectors. We have the western sector, we have the central sector, and then we have the eastern sector. But the problem here is that when say LAC, it is not something that is seen as the same line when we are talking about China and India. So it is not mutually agreed, it is not demarcated, and it is not a properly mapped boundary. What we get to see as of now in the name of LAC is only a military control line that unfortunately emerged after 1962. Now, because of this very non-clarity that lies in front of us, we get to see that both sides patrol as per their own interpretations, own perceptions, and this leads to overlapping zones, and also it is the source of friction that we get to see in form of standoffs, in form of the border tension that have remained and that have recently eased out in the last year. Now, when we are talking about a settled border, we have to see that LAC starkly differs from there, because here we get to see the geography is changed into a bargaining as well as a pressure space, especially by our neighbor China. So China deliberately does not want to mark a particular boundary, because if it remains fluid, if it remains demarked, if it remains revisable, they will be able to use it for coercion and strategic pressure every now and then without actually looking into the possibility of a war. And that is why we are talking about this ambiguity, which China is least interested to resolve because it favors them and they have strategically used it every now and then whenever they need it. Now, when we are talking about line of actual control and the border not being properly marked, the main contention comes from this one particular thing, that is McMahon line. So when we talk about McMahon line, that also gives us an insight into understanding that how this line came into the picture, why even after China was party to the conference where it was finalized, China does not agree on it, and why till date China keeps on rejecting it. So when we talk about this Shimla conference which happened in 1913-14, we have to understand the delegates were from India, Tibet as well as China during this very conference, and there was exchange of letters between British Indian and Tibetan authorities, because in the end what McMahon line marked, China did not sign the final letter of exchange, but initially it did agree to it. Now, because Tibet at that point of time had the autonomy and they had the powers to make the treaty, so they entered into this exchange of letters with the Indian authorities, which led to the establishment and understanding of McMahon line that lies in front of us. And China gave a very simple reason to not sign the final agreement, that they said that when we are talking about this convention, that inner outer Tibet should be signed. It should not be marked as a India-Tibet boundary, and that is what was the reason for the refusal here. Later, by 1950, when China got the control over Tibet, and that is when they went for retrospective reinterpretation of this whole situation, and they were the ones to put it up as legally invalid. But for India, because we were the parties where the letter of exchange was signed, it remained legally valid, and China used this very argument when it did not have the control over Tibet, that Tibet signed this particular document, that is not legally valid. So China rejects it today because it has a strategic and a political advantage, not the historical evidence in this very context. Now that we have a fair idea, especially on McMahon line, now let us move into the history, that how exactly did the concept of LAC, that is line of actual control, came up to be, and why this concept remains dangerous if it is not properly understood by both of these countries as well. So when we are talking about emerging of this very concept, that is LAC, you have to understand that this particular articulation was not given by India. In 1959, Chinese premier, that is Zhou Enlai, he was the one who introduced this term, that is line of actual control. And he was the one, he said that we will be defining this line up to the point where each side exercised control. That was the time when China had offered that we will be withdrawing the troops where we have made incursions, especially in the eastern sector, if India allows their aggression, if India allows the marking of the place in Aksai Chin where China had incurred. Now, in this situation, if we would have to accept this, that means we would be justifying Chinese aggression, especially in Aksai Chin. We will be legitimizing this. So, in 1960, we went ahead and rejected the proposal, the term and the understanding of LAC that came from China's end. But that is what resulted into the 1962 war, where unfortunately line of actual control emerged as a de facto operational reality. It was not negotiated, it was not discussed, it was not agreed. It was enforced on ground, and as there is nothing that holds it, China finds it fluid, revisable and changeable. When we are talking about LAC, line of actual control, it was marked on the basis of withdrawal of troops in the eastern sector, NEFA, that is Arunachal Pradesh of present time, and the Aksai Chin region. This remains very part of India, but line of actual control was marked right here. Now, this is how line of actual control gradually emerged over the years in 1959 to 1962. But we also have to move to understand why India finally had to agree, and how did we agree to line of actual control? Did we also sign something? Did we give a final agreement to it? So after 1962, we saw in 1986 there was Chinese incursion again in Guangdong, which marked another standoff in the Sumdorong Chu Valley near Tawang in Arunachal Pradesh. Now, this made the border militarized, and escalation between both of the countries kept rising. And after that, after visit of our then foreign minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee and diplomacy, we saw that finally we had something on the table in the form of 1993 Border Peace and Tranquility Agreement. In this, India accepted line of actual control, but only as a temporary management mechanism. That means this is not something final that India agreed to, and it explicitly said that this is not a legal boundary. And after that, as an outcome, LAC is recognized as a temporary boundary or temporary mechanism to ensure that this border dispute is resolved. After that, we saw 2 decades of comparatively peaceful, stable environment, but that was without settlement. Now, when we are talking about LAC, we have to understand that across the 3 sectors, the most volatile sectors are the western sector and the eastern sector. However, when we talk about the eastern sector, India follows the highest watershed principle that marks the boundary. However, China keeps talking about literal cartographic interpretation, but India controls this territory. India is the one which remains in the control. There are certain small pockets where we get to see Chinese aggression here and there. However, the most stable and the least contentious is the central middle sector, which is of Uttarakhand and Himachal border. But here we find problems with the Nepal border when we are talking about Kalapani, when we are talking about Lipu Lake. And this is also again used by China in their own ways. Furthermore, when we are talking of western sector, this is the most volatile sector that remains, because when we are talking about the claim lines, they keep on shifting every now and then. We got to see multiple standoffs, including the ones from 2019 to 2022. And that have happened because of the overlapping petrol routes. For example, the Galwan Valley issue that we saw. The Siachen Glacier remains volatile and sensitive because of the very same reason. And if we move to the present scenario that we have in front of us, we have to understand that as of now, the temporary mechanism that we had set in place, that has collapsed. That has collapsed because LAC clarification does not work as of now, because by the 2002 year, we saw the mechanism through which maps were to be exchanged and the settlement to be made. That was done only for the middle sector, which is the least contentious one, least sensitive one. And when the chance came for the western sector map, China was the one which refused. That means China did not want any finality on that, and that is when after 2 years, 2004, we saw China clearly withdrawing from the agreement, from the settlement that had been in place for the clarification. So this seems like a very strategic decision where ambiguity was chosen to enable the incremental gains that China can make, and this undecisive line which China would like to keep to ensure that they can play out in the grey zone. We will be discussing about grey zone in detail, but now let us move directly to understand that how this has enabled Arunachal Pradesh becoming flashpoint for India-China issues yet again. When we are talking about Arunachal Pradesh as a flashpoint, we have to understand in the times of 1950s to 1980s, Chinese leaders talked about the package deal where we will be trading east for west. If you want Chinese aggression incursion not to happen in east, then you have to legitimize their claims in the west, that is Ladakh sector. But this changed after 1980s when there is some sort of thawing in relationship, diplomatic relationship between India and China happened, and China changed their course. They started asking for concessions, especially in Arunachal. If you look at the 2005 agreement, it talked about protected settled population, limiting Chinese flexibility, and all of a sudden China again flipped and it revived that Arunachal Pradesh is the South Tibet, it is the Zhangnan region, and this narrative has been used since then to pin Arunachal Pradesh. Renaming of places, marking it in their maps, administrative harassment of the Indian nationalists using Indian passports who are residents of Arunachal Pradesh, and indicating assertive territorial intent, clearly bring it onto the table that they are not going for any sort of negotiation, rather they are enjoying changing the course and not letting go of the western sector, but also trying to eye for the eastern sector, which is not theirs to eye for. Now when we have a fair clarity that how China has been taking turns over the time in terms of deciding LAC, what they want in the eastern and western sector boundary, what LAC is, how important it is, and how it came into the picture, and also having a fair idea of McMahon line. Now let us understand that how it is using this strategic ambiguity to their advantage. So when we talk about strategic ambiguity, I am clearly saying this as a deliberate non-clarification that they are doing for line of actual control. Even after there is existence of proper agreements and recognition of some sort of common understanding, China is not deliberately going for any clarification. So this shows that China wants to retain flexibility. If you come for negotiation, your flexibility will be gone, your U-turns that you have been taken will be gone, and that is going to impact the patrols, that is going to impact the deployments, and it will also formally change the status quo which is present. And in this context, that is why China is ensuring that through refusal of exchanging maps, especially of the western sector after 1996, furthermore shifting the claims and the perceptions as well as the narratives around it, rather than going for a legal principle, and then using of grey zone tactics. As I said, we will be discussing the grey zone techniques that China has been using, where they are making incremental advances, patrol obstruction. All these are the tactics through which you cannot mark it as an act of war, but it nudges the country, it pushes the country, it rattles them. So there is no extreme possibility, but you are not diplomatic, you are not diplomatic friends also. So you operate in the grey area, and that is what China has been doing with India for the longest time. China has been operating just below the threshold of war to ensure that India is on its toes in terms of strategic pressure. And because of this, India has to ensure its safety, and for that they maintain the permanent high force deployment to ensure that there are not escalated risks that are involved. They have to ensure that they maintain access, because they have seen loss of access without loss of territory, especially when we are talking about 2020 Eastern Ladakh situation, and constant boundary management, because diplomacy cannot be the only key to solve this problem. So we also have to ensure continuous military deterrence. We have to show that we are ready, we are there, even though you are operating just below the threshold of war, we know what is going on and we are prepared. China making a big dam just above Arunachal, India has to prepare in terms of hydropower and its sustainability. China going for huge airspaces and go downs near Ladakh, India has also gone for betterment and making of airspaces, renewing the Daulat Old Begi. All such platforms, such things have been done. That means India is also engaging economically. India has to contribute the energy in that direction, and China wants to continue that, because over the time this ambiguity has favored China. How it has favored China? It prevents India for fixing or internationalizing the boundary, because on one part we are in some sort of temporary agreement. So we cannot internationalize the boundary, we cannot say this is the final boundary, and it gives China the space to ensure that they can make small changes, use the grey zone warfare tactics and change the ground reality, and at least try to do that without triggering in an extreme situation. And at the same time, because we are in a temporary arrangements, it also ensures that they can come back on the table. They have the bargaining leverage all the time. So all in all, even though India seems well prepared, India has been anticipating all this. The reason China is not stopping, that all of this favors China very well throughout. Now on this note, I will be concluding, because the India-China boundary issue is no longer about where LAC is, it is about how China is using to put in a narrative, to nudge, to use the grey zone warfare tactics. What are your thoughts on this? Let me know in the comment section. That was all from my side. Thank you so much.